Hi, this is T. Franklin, and you're listening to Southern Fried Geekery.
1, 2, 3. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 65 of the Southern Fried Geekery podcast. This is Caleb, as usual, and if you've been listening to the show, you know I've been doing a lot of traveling over the past month, and that's why we haven't had our usual episodes. But we have something special this episode. I am at the AWP conference, that is the Association of Writers and Writing Programs conference. It's held in Portland, Oregon, and was very, very happy to find out that they have a lot of comics content here. So I was able to attend some panels and talk to some really great people that are very informative. And so if you've ever considered what literary comics might be like, or what it might be like to teach a literary comics course, enjoy this show. It's a bit of a long one, but buckle up because there's some amazing things. First, we're going to listen to a panel that was put on by Drawn and Quarterly, a publisher out of Canada that has produced some amazing books. And the panel features Craig Thompson, who is the award-winning author of Blankets and Habibi, Rena Ayuyang, the author of Blame This on the Boogie, James Stern from Market Days and the Golem's Mighty Swing, as well as Peter Bagg, the Eisner-winning author of Hate and Weird Magazine. Also Credo, the Rose Wilder Lane stories. You've also seen his work with a lot of the R. Crumb stuff from way back in the day. You got to start in the 70s. And then after that, we're going to another panel that I personally loved. It features a lot of people who are teaching comics at the collegiate level. And this one features Sara Leavitt, Jennifer Mervin, and Arkansas's very own Sandy Longhorn, who is a professor at the University of Central Arkansas. So if you've ever wondered what it might be like to think of comics as a collegiate endeavor, or what it might be like to teach a class if you're a professor, you'll really enjoy this. They drop some great educational moments. They offer up some incredibly poignant thoughts on what comics are and the creative process, as well as list a number of books that can be used as textbooks or just anything to get you thinking creatively about comics. So enjoy the show, and we will see you all soon.
My name is Candida Rifkin, and I teach and research comics and graphic novels at the University of Winnipeg in Canada, and I'm on the executive board of the Comic Studies Society, css.org, if you want to learn more about that. So before we begin, I have a few reminders. There is a pamphlet going around, so please make sure you get one. If anyone wants to follow along with a larger print document, we have 5 here. Please let us know, or just come up and grab one if you need that. Please make sure the spaces marked for wheelchairs remain clear of chairs or other barriers. Treat service animals as working animals and do not attempt to distract or pet them. Be aware of those with chemical sensitivities and refrain from wearing perfume, which, don't apply perfume right now, I guess. And please be aware that your fellow attendees may have invisible disabilities. Do not question anyone's use of an accommodation while at the conference, including use of chairs reserved for those with disabilities. We realize the lines for the bathrooms may be long, but please refrain from using an accessible stall unless you require such accommodation. Please also be aware family restrooms located on level 2 are reserved for those with disabilities or those wishing to use a single stall restroom. So we're going to begin. We have 4 cartoonists here, and I want to thank Drawn and Quarterly Publishing in Montreal for putting this panel together. I'm really excited to be in the company of such comics elite, if you will. I don't want to embarrass them. But we're going to start with a couple of rounds where each cartoonist is going to talk about their recent work. And because we have the pamphlet, you can follow along with some images. Then we'll talk a little bit about the title of the panel in terms of the literary graphic novel and see what the cartoonists think about that in relation to their work. And then we'll open it up for questions. So our first speaker, and we're going down in this order, is Craig Thompson. Craig Thompson is a cartoonist and the author of the award-winning books Blankets, Carnet de Voyage, Goodbye Chunky Rice, and Habibi. He was born in Michigan, should I say the year you were born? In 1975, and grew up in a rural farming community in central Wisconsin. His graphic novel Blankets, which is available at the D&Q booth, I think it's 8004, won numerous industry awards and has been published in nearly 20 languages around the world. Thompson lives right here in Portland. He'll be talking about his next comic book, which will be a 12-issue series called Ginseng Roots. So Craig, can you tell us where you got the idea for the book and how it's going to take shape?
The idea, I think, started with maybe Michael Pollan's book, Botany of Desire. where he writes about 4 plants that shaped human civilization as much as we've shaped them. And it struck me that in this like age of environmental crisis, the plants themselves have a story to tell. And the plant that I have the most intimate relationship with is ginseng, the Canadian medicinal root. Because growing up in rural Wisconsin, it was the largest producer of cultivated American ginseng in the world. And as a child, I worked for like 10 years in that industry, starting when I was 10 years old. And so there's an autobiographical element. There's a little bit of continuation of blankets with my family dynamics and my relationship with my brother, but really it's sort of a springboard to explore themes around this plant, which has a lot to do with the trade relationship with China and the New World before we were even established as a country. And so it's a way to explore global trade, holistic attitudes towards medicine, but also holistic attitudes towards sort of global problems. Lots of themes around immigration and the way that the agricultural industry has changed just since I was a child. So industrialization of our corporate farming and immigrant workers and so that's sort of like it's sprawling. Ginseng is sort of the Moby Dick in this new project. And because I've done these long form books before, I didn't feel like I had the stamina to like hole up in my studio for close to a decade again, especially at this age. So for the first time in my career, I'm serializing this one as comic books. It's going to be a bi-monthly series. And I'm sure I'll be doing events at least in Portland in like May or June for the first issue. I've never done comic books before. I've done my whole career as graphic novels. But I grew up reading this more modest incarnation of the medium. And we live in an age now of serialized media, so it just felt instinctual to me.
Can I just ask before we go on, Craig, you said it's autobiographical, so is this more comics journalism or are you a character in the book?
Both. I think the entry point for myself and the reader is the continuation of like little Craig in rural Wisconsin. And so I have a decade worth of experience doing this, the labor side of things. And then there's sort of a carte de voyage element of travel, because I ended up traveling through China, the Jilin province of China along the border of North Korea, and I was in South Korea and different parts of Asia, kind of explored like the actual roots of ginseng as a plant and as medicine.
That's a pun, right?
Yeah, I know. It's terrible. The title's kind of obvious.
Okay. Thanks so much. So now we'll move on to our second speaker or panelist, Rena Aguyang, who was born and raised in Pittsburgh. Rena was always inspired by the Sunday newspaper funnies and slice of life tales. I'm going to read a bio first.
Oh, okay.
Her short stories have been nominated for the Ignatz and Eisner Awards, which are really prestigious comics awards, and she's been honored with a MoCA Arts Festival Awards of Excellence Silver Medal. Her comics have appeared in, is it Mutha or Muta magazine?
Mother.
Mother magazine and the Comics Journal. She's also the publisher of the microcomics imprint Yam Books. Her first book was Whirlwind Wonderland, and she lives in Oakland, California with her husband and son. And maybe you can tell us about your new book and where the idea came from.
So my new book is Blame This on the Boogie. And it was really just wanted to have a celebration of musicals and dance that sort of kept me going during rough spots of my life, during childhood and then becoming a parent, having my own child. And what I wanted to do with the book was I wanted to sort of try to make a musical in a comics form, and that was pretty ambitious. So it was just basically trying to, especially during a lot of difficult times and things going on with the world, it was sort of like how musicals, keep people, especially sort of like just like in the Great Depression when people would watch musicals to kind of get away from the harsh realities and having to think about the problems in the world and in their life. So I wanted to make sort of this sort of joyous book, like a feel-good book.
What's your favorite musical?
I was in a book club. this book club in Oakland asked me the same question, and it got a little wild because there was a bunch of like random ones, like new ones I didn't know, like "Step It Up," and I think that's music. But my favorite is Xanadu because it's just full on, man, just drug fueled, airbrushed. Don't care if it makes sense. And Gene Kelly's in it, Olivia Newton-John's in it. It's just ridiculous.
And roller skates.
Yeah, roller skates, airbrush, California. LA, yeah, crazy.
Thanks so much, Rena. Our third panelist is James Sturm. James lives in Heartland, Vermont with his wife and two daughters, where he helps run a cartooning school that he co-founded, the Center for Cartoon Studies. James's graphic novels include The Golem's Mighty Swing, Market Day, and James Sturm's America. His other books include Satchel Paige, Striking Out Jim Crow, The Fantastic Four, Unstable Molecules, Dennis Wortman's New York, and the popular Adventures in Cartooning series. His comics, writing, and illustrations have appeared in scores of national and regional publications, including the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Onion, The New York Times, and on the cover of The New Yorker. He is also a contributing editor and cartoonist to Slate, and is a co-founder of the Seattle weekly The Stranger. So, James, can you tell us about your new book?
Yeah, is this working? Good.
Yes.
Yeah, my new book is called Off Season, and what Rena said about cartooning to kind of help you get through rough times. I think that's probably something a lot of cartoonists can maybe relate to. And I was going through a kind of an off season, and rather than turn my anger outward and kill somebody, I decided to make a graphic novel, or not kill, but yes. It was a contractor, so you know how that goes. So I was doing a graphic novel about a newly separated couple with two young kids, and them in this kind of off season of their life, and trying to figure out a way to come back to one another, and if that's even possible. And I was working on the book for about a year, and then 2016 happened, and I realized like who these characters were. Like they would be talking about the election. That would be part of it, like, you know, part of their life, like it is everybody's. And I realized like so much of what was happening in the election, like I was already playing out in their relationship on this subtle, in this way. So those two things started resonating with each other. So then the book got set against the backdrop of the 2016 election. So it's kind of like a love story, more than anything else, I think. Although some have read it as kind of a political allegory. And you had asked, they all have dog heads, and you had asked me to address that, so I'll just say that a lot of times in my sketchbooks, you know, trying to figure out what a character looks like, and then getting stressed out about being able to draw them in the right, you know, through all the different angles. So I'll just throw a dog head on them, and that'll be the placeholder. And you know, like weird things start feeling normal after a while. And then that kind of felt right given the whole political thing too. I mean, not that it feels normal, but it gets a little more normalized as opposed to like freaking out all the time. So that's where that came from.
Great, thank you. And our final panelist is Peter Bagg. Peter Bagg is the Harvey Award-winning author of the acclaimed 1990s alternative comic series Hate, starring slacker hero Buddy Bradley, and a regular contributor to Reason magazine. A graduate of the School of Visual Arts in New York City, he got his start in comics in the R. Crumb-edited magazine Weirdo. Bagg lives in Seattle with his wife Joanne, daughter, and 3 cats. And he's here to talk about his new book. So can you tell us about it?
Yeah, my latest book, it's called Credo, and subtitled The Rose Wilder Lane Story. And it's the third of a series of graphic novel biographies I've done for Joint and Quarterly. All 3 of them are about, the theme is they're all women who are very active and at their most prolific in the years between the 2 world wars. The previous ones are Margaret Sanger, the birth control advocate, and the next one was about Zora Neale Hurston, the African-American author and anthropologist. Rose Wilder Lane is best known as the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and over the last couple of decades, it's become pretty widely acknowledged that, if not so much co-write, very heavily edit the whole Little House on the Prairie series with her mother. How I came to Rose Wilder Lane, though, was I was not at all, because I hated the TV show so much, I never considered reading any of the books. Those books are good. That's the last thing I read in researching the Rose Wilder Lane story was the Little House on the Prairie books. But I came across her from reading this book. It was about the history of the libertarian movement called Radicals for Capitalism. And this one character, Rose Wilder Lane, who at this time, they were writing about a time in her life where she was in her 50s, living in Danbury, Connecticut. And she was so opposed to rationing food during World War II that as protest, this 50-ish-year-old, not particularly healthy writer decided she was going to grow all of her own food. And she did. And I was like, this person is crazy. And the more I read about her, the more struck I was by a lot of different things. Her extreme, through the course of her life, she started out as a socialist, but after experiences traveling through Eastern Europe, she very much changed her mind on that, to the point of becoming pretty much, at least personally in her own mind, she was an anarchist. She thought that all government systems were inherently evil, although she also acknowledged that humans hadn't evolved enough to the point of living without government. But she led like with the other one I wrote about, she led an incredibly amazing life. Her own work is little known now, and not much of her own writing is in print. But in the 20s and 30s, she was the highest paid female author in the United States. The books that she wrote, her own books, not the work she did with her mother, but the books particularly that she wrote in the 1930s, her fiction, were fantastic. Really great writing. It's amazing that she's been so forgotten. Almost buried by her mother's legacy, I would almost say. And also just her own life story, her personal struggles. Like she clearly, a modern reader, when you'd read about her now and read her own writing and her diaries, she clearly suffered from what we now call bipolar disorder. And in fact, it wasn't until late in her life, she was reading a magazine article, and it was the first time she came across the expression manic depression, which later they refer to as bipolar disorder. And in the magazine, when she saw it, she circled the word manic depression and wrote, "That's me." And so through her whole life too, she also, while struggling with her disorder, she also always acknowledged it and did a lot of self-medicating. She went through an awful lot to deal with her rather severe mental disorder. And that also included dealing with her mother. So if you're a fan of, I'm always reluctant to say if you're a fan of Laura Ingalls Wilder, you should read this book. You might hate it because her mother doesn't come across as a saint when you're writing from her daughter's perspective. Just like for fans of Laura Ingalls Wilder, they tend to have a very negative impression of her daughter Rose, simply because the two fought a lot, and it's hard not to take sides. And I take Rose's side. Actually, no, I try really hard to be fair.
Thanks so much, Peter. So since we are talking about comics and graphic novels, I think I would like to hear from each cartoonist about their visual style and their influences and how they came to their style a little bit. You have very different styles, each of you. And I know it might be hard for you to describe your own style. That's maybe what comic scholars like me should be doing. But we want to hear from the horse's mouth. So can I ask you again, just going down this row, starting with Craig, can you tell us what you see as your style of visual storytelling and what maybe your influences are?
I think I've sort of ripped off or borrowed influence from a sort of new wave, not so new anymore, but new wave of French cartoonists that came out around the end of the 90s, the L'Association crowd, who were very much influenced by Peter and his comrades, Dan Klaus and the Hernandez brothers and Julie Doucet. So 90s Chester Brown, James Sturm, 90s indie cartoonists were inspiring this new generation of French cartoonists that were probably really sick of sort of the tropes of bande dessinée, like this very fixed, fantasy-oriented French comic album. And they wanted to do something that was much more alternative and indie and black and white. And so they formed this collective of some of the people that might be known are like David Bay, who did Epileptic, Marjan Satrapi was part of that group, and so in the year 2000 they published this 2,000-page wordless international comics anthology. James, you're in that, right? It was called 2000. It was 2,000 pages. They only printed 2,000 copies, so it's almost impossible to find a book. But it changed everything for me because it introduced me to all these amazing international artists. So not exclusively French, but there were a few that I really kind of tried to copy and emulate. It wasn't conscious, but when you're a young cartoonist, you just wear your influences on your sleeve. And so I would acknowledge like everyone from AWP, who I mentioned, to Louis Trondheim and Lutch and Edmond Baudouin, and some of those surface elements of the way that their expressive brush line and stuff is what I was trying to emulate in my own work. Also, the way that they were pumping out these like 500-page books, which at that point was pretty rare. It didn't really exist in U.S. comics. So,
great. Thank you. Rena, your style is very colorful and kinetic and dynamic. So can you tell us about how you sort of came to your style and maybe what challenges and joys it brings?
So my style is, like I think you said, panelist, because it comes, I was highly influenced by just drawing in my sketchbook every day, and that was one way that I started doing comics again. I was like, okay, January 1st, I'm gonna just draw something every day and feel productive about it. And so the sketchbook started to have a lot more narrative as a part of it, and that's how it came to be like no panels and just sort of like pages of just filling up the whole page. So I guess my influence is doodling, but and then I started using colored pencils. I was like, hey, there's a colored pencil here, and so I started just doing that. But I use colored pencils really like hard on the paper. I don't go light, so it tends to look like marker. But a lot of the color influences are from like the West Coast figuralist movement, the Bay Area Bay Area painters. That having that palette, like Wayne Thiebaud and David Parks and all these really colorful painters. Those influenced just like the joy of having color in comics. And so yeah, that's pretty much all. Yeah.
Thanks. And James, you published several books. Maybe the styles aren't all the same, but do you want to talk about maybe how your style has developed a bit, or how you see
sure.
it?
In the latest book, Off Season, I definitely see Charles Schultz's influence. The book's very much kind of infused with this melancholy tone. Its characters are pared down. Everybody has a head like Snoopy. Snoopy's doghouse is on the cover. So there's that, and there's probably kind of like that Ashcan school tradition as well, which I'm really fond of. For those not familiar, I think the cartoonist Art Young came up with the phrase the Ashcan with all these painters. Instead of painting these glorious landscapes and portraits, they would draw the pool halls and people hanging laundry and ash cans and around the early 1900s. So like really enjoying. I think after the election season, and then also like not paying attention to my contractor, there was a moment like everyone woke up and like we weren't paying attention. Oh my God! And everybody's like, we got to pay attention now so this doesn't happen again. So in my book, like the protagonist drives my car. My neighbor's house is in there. A lot of the supermarkets in my area. So it was really very grounding to try to just draw right in front of me, whereas in the past I was drawing historic fiction, so I was working with photos. I was kind of looking at a screen a lot because, if you want to see what a shtetl looks like in, 1890, you have to go online or get a book. So there was a lot more, direct observational drawing in the work as well.
That's great, thanks. So, Peter, your 3 books about these radical women have a fairly consistent style. Can you talk about your influences and why you choose this style for these stories?
Well, the style that I chose is my style, and it mainly just not to overthink it. These books, especially with all the research involved, they were hard enough to do and to think about how to format that I didn't bother thinking about altering my style in any way. And the way I draw, well, when I was young, my biggest influences would be newspaper strips, funny newspaper strips, Mad Magazine back in the 60s, but also probably what is most noticeable and most commented on with my drawing style is this rubberiness that I get largely from trying to recreate, albeit on the printed page, that fluidity and movement that I would most associate with Warner Brother cartoons, an animated look, but very much old 1940s era Warner Brother cartoons. Beyond that, pretty much it's not necessarily style, it's not so much the way I draw, but I would say, even though you wouldn't necessarily see it to look at it, but I would say the biggest influence on me, though, were the first wave of underground cartoonists, especially the ones that would write about more personal things. Not just obviously Robert Crumb, but Bill Griffith and Kim Deitch and Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, Diane Newman and Bob Armstrong. That crew, they were the ones that really wanted to make me be a cartoon, not just a cartoonist, to pursue it as a career, but also to do comic books like theirs, do what became known as alternative comics. But yeah, I can't think of too many people who worked in the alternative comic scene or the underground scene that had that rubbery animated look like mine do. I suppose a few did, but that's what that's all about.
Thanks. So another question I have is about storytelling, because we're at the AWP, and I'm wondering if you could address, you said your sketchbook became a narrative. So I've always been curious with cartoonists about the tension between, drawing each panel versus having to build up a narrative. And maybe for other cartoonists or writers in the crowd, you could talk about how you balance the drawing and the writing, the creating the visual narrative and the verbal narrative. Do you write scripts first and then draw the panels, or does it come all together? I guess this is a question about process in terms of narrative and storytelling. So, maybe you should start because you've already sort of broached the topic.
Okay. So yeah, I think a part of the sketchbook thing is just like having some sort of stream, starting with how I do it is I have a sort of stream of consciousness going, like what am I thinking at the time, and it probably kind of evolves and becomes just sort of like this babbling thought in my head, and it keeps going. I think my style is more, I guess, conversational, but the way I create the page is I also want the reader to have some interaction with the reader, and also have them kind of do some work too, and kind of I think my page is sort of I like to treat it as sort of like a treasure map in a way. Like there's all these little hidden things, and just again like just doing a sort of a doodly type thing. But my process is very organic. I have a general outline or a like feel of what's going to happen in the story. A lot of the times the ending totally changes. Like right when it's almost done, it's like, oh no, I found something better. And so there isn't anything. It's very organic. It's just I know that I wanted to write about my childhood and my family coming to the United States and dealing with being a Filipino American and thinking about being different but also being the same in this kind of predominantly white town, and celebrating pop culture and just celebrating the same things that any American would be celebrating. So I think it was how I approached it was just more looking at it as a movie and just looking at it visually and just sort of following that same kind of sort of Hollywood narrative of just like a happy ending type thing. But yeah, I have a really bad process. Like I tell that to everybody. I don't script. I don't thumbnail. I hate penciling, so it's a very it's I guess it's ADD in some way. Like I also have to like do things. I always feel like I have to do things in a rush, so I'm always doing a lot of my drawings while I'm on the go, and so the things that I use are always portable, like like felt tip pens or things that I can just put in my bag real quick, and right now I don't even have like a studio or like I used to have. Telling Craig, I used to have an office in my apartment, but then I had a kid, so I don't have I don't have that room anymore. There are some little pieces of it that still look like an office. Like there's a printer on like the corner there, not being used as usual. But so it's just usually like my influences are just like when I had having conversations with people or having certain moments and writing those things down. And then, and then just sort of documenting it. I think that's how it began, was I was documenting moments.
That's great. Thanks. Who'd like to go next?
For off-season, I started a different process. I used to do drafts and then another draft, and I've been using index cards. I go to like 99-cent stores and get those 4x6 photo albums, and then just cards. I thought about. I just was writing vignettes about these characters that I was curious about, and I would. Cartooning is picture writing. I don't write a script out first. It's the images often are telling the story, and are kind of directing you where to go. So I can't not include those. And then I would just kind of doodle out these index cards, and maybe I'd tack them on my wall and rearrange them and then put them in these photo albums and see how they work as a flip book. And then I did another one and another one. I became more and more kind of curious about the characters. And it just kind of, it grew from there. And there wasn't really any, I had no idea how it was going to look as a book. I wasn't even thinking that far ahead. And then I did know that those index cards also looked like the screen of a phone. So I could serialize this online and it would be very readable on a phone, which I wound up doing on Slate. So that worked out. But it was a much more organic process, kind of figuring out. And then at a certain point, there's a critical mass, and then you're, editing the stories and adding new vignettes and moving things around until, the whole thing lands and feels like a literary graphic novel.
Which we will come to next. So we've heard the word organic twice, so I want to come to Craig and ask about your process. And of course, Craig and Peter do more research-based work, I think, before you get to the stage of building the narrative. So Craig, can you tell us about your process?
Okay, well, I guess the Habibi is an example of a research-based project. But similar to what James was describing, I use the drawing drafts over drafts technique, where I'll draw and discard hundreds of pages before I get to the final drawing stage. So with Habibi, I spent like 2 years full-time just doing like a thumbnail version of the book, which is pretty detailed already. It's designed to be read by an editor. I had an editor at that time, and my first readers, my friends. So it's very detailed. And because you learn so much about the story during the process of a drawing, I think that's why they're not literal thumbnails. They could be much more simple, but as I get lost in a drawing, more story elements come. So I spent 2 years on that, and I still didn't know the end of the book. And I was stuck in this sort of like research and rewriting procrastination loop, where I finally resolved to just sit down and start drawing pages. Because again, drawing takes a long time, so new revelations happen. I've never known the ending of a book before I started drawing it, and I know that's not the proper way, apparently, to write a story. But I think it all happens in real time in the process. So, and the research, I don't know. For me, I guess, it's inspiring. That's where I get soak up a lot of new influences, so that I can hopefully, the new book is really influenced by Chinese painting and Chinese calligraphy in the same way that Habibi was informed by Arabic calligraphy and geometric design. But at a certain point, it does feel like a procrastination loop for me. And I just got to sit down and make something of my own. I can just get lost in that sort of research rabbit hole forever.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Do you want to tell us about doing these biographies and when you stopped doing the research and start drawing the story and building the narrative?
Right. Well, once I feel like I've taken in as much information as my brain can hold when it comes to researching these biographical figures, then I start the same process that I would with any of these long-form comics, graphic novels, if you will. And especially because I used to approach things occasionally the way the rest did, a bit more organically when I was working in a shorter form. Some of it was just all about the art, and there wouldn't even necessarily be a story or a coherent story. But doing these long-form books, I would do everything the right way, which is write an outline, break the outline down into pages, then write a script. I'd even type on a script writing format, like script thing or final draft. And then from that, all roughs, I would rough out the whole thing on printer paper and a ballpoint pen, and then go to the final art, penciling, lots of layers of penciling and inking, and it's not that rigid. And that even when I'm penciling and inking, I'll still be tweaking the script. I won't be sticking rigidly to this script, but it still is pretty formalized. I do it the right way. They're all crazy, especially Rena. Do not do it her way.
Okay, James?
I just add one thing. I just hearing this right way. I mean, I think probably everybody out there teaches or is a writing person, there's that imposter syndrome, like I'm not doing this the right way. And I helped start this MFA program that the Center for Cartoon Studies. We have a visiting artist every week that comes to the school. And the one constant of seeing 13 years of visiting artists is there's no freaking right way to do anything. It's just the way, and then even if you find the quote unquote right way, it might not serve you on your next project because you're starting this universe with its own new set of laws that then you have to kind of learn and figure out.
So do you find each project teaches you the process to do the work?
For me, yeah. And unfortunately, I wish I had some locked-in style, I look at Ben Catcher, whatever this cartoonist Ben Catcher, some of you might know, I think he went on a journalism assignment to do surfers in Hawaii. And his this gravitational force of his cartooning, I think your work's like that. You'll just bring it to,
James,
whatever
is your
subject
mic,
into your
mic
sensibility.
working?
Oh, is this? You'll bring the subject into your sensibility. I feel like whatever project I'm doing, it has a greater gravitational force than my personal style, so I have to kind of accommodate that. And I think some cartoonists are just, they have a certain style and way of working that is very powerful.
Okay. This is actually a good segue into thinking about the title of the panel, the literary graphic novel, because some people say the graphic novel is this kind of auteurist thing where it's a very clear signature style and it's not collaborative, it's a single artist and so on. So I wanted to ask each of you where you land on the debate about graphic novel versus comics, because the terminology is itself controversial. Is graphic novels just trying to gentrify comics and make them more respectable, or put them in bookstores, not comic book stores? And what do you see as the relationship between your work and so-called literature? Right? Do you think of your work as comics? Do you like the term graphic novels? It's a good time for the graphic novel, so we don't necessarily want to diss it. But how do you feel about where we are right now with the kind of work you do in terms of publishing and readership and the market?
Just one thing I want to say is both the old term comic books and this new term graphic novels, they're both misnomers. Like with comic books, that they weren't all meant to be funny. The word comic implies funny. Superman wasn't intended to be funny. It's ridiculous, but it wasn't intended to be funny. And the same with graphic novels. It's basically you're just describing a format. It's a catch-all term for a square-bound book that happens to have comics in it. For example, what I'm doing is a novel. I have done novels in comic book form, but these are biographies. And my next one's probably a memoir, and a lot of what they've all done are memoirs, not necessarily novels. So it's, but at the same time, that's the term that people use. Comic books was an awkward term, but that's what everybody used. Now it's the same with graphic novels, and you're basically just picturing a square-bound book full of drawings, words and drawings combined.
Okay.
And I would say, I was referencing that L'Association anthology from 2000. And that's just a couple years before Blankets was released. And for me at that time, I was really resistant to comic book store culture, which is where most people had to go to find comics. They weren't really in bookstores other than a small handful like Archie Goodwin's Mouse. So I didn't like the culture of comic shops. They were kind of creepy, exclusive places, and and they had to do a lot with the collector mentality, and people having things in little plastic bags and boards and rummaging through long boxes. And I was seeing what was happening with the French cartoonists and having something with a spine on the bookshelf like any other book in your home, that you actually spend more time with. The collectors I don't know how they revisit the material in the same way. So, and it was just a sea change that happened around that time, that, Jimmy Corrigan's, Chris Ware's Jimmy Corrigan was released, where he had been serializing that for years, but then it just made this huge sort of impact as a graphic novel that reached outside of the very insular comic book community to, the fine art community and the literary community. So I think it just helps, bring in more readers. I think comics are very instinctual, medium with a wide appeal. They just need to reach those audiences, and the quote-unquote graphic novels help that happen.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think a couple of years ago there was it was a huge controversy, right? And so for a while I was like, no, this is comics. I'm come from the DIY, the mini comic zine community, and so we make our own books and we staple them. So I always thought it was kind of like comics was the lowbrow art form, and it wasn't this object to be put in a pedestal, I don't know. And so I just and to see my work as a graphic novelist, I want to say hysterical, but I'm right next to James and these guys, and I guess Peter too. It's kind of crazy, but yeah, like Craig said, just like that, it gets into comics now is now in conferences like these. It's in schools, and James has a school for cartooning, and so it's not just in the Sunday Funnies or in the kids section of a library or the kids section of the bookstore or in those creepy comic shops anymore. And anyone could do it. It's not just these dudes who draw superhero comics or it's anybody can. And so that comes from the DIY culture too that I was that I was inspired by when I started doing comics. Yeah.
I don't think it's either or too. I think everybody's graphic novel, they're not novels, they're nonfiction.
I think we're okay about it now.
I think it's whatever now, right?
Someone
we can get a review in the New York Times, great. You get a graphic novel. But I don't think one negates the other. You can still love zines and hand-printed comics, and what I love also about comics is no stigma with self-publishing, like maybe some of the other fields have as well, literary field. I think when I think of the word literature, maybe there's some kind of intent question there, what maybe, and you can do literature in different genres, but I think it's maybe a question of what what you're shooting for is how ambitious perhaps you are as a writer or cartoonist.
Thanks. So I do want to ask about the digital comics, because James, you said you posted the first part of off seasons on Slate.
Yeah, it was serialized.
So we've been talking about bound books and objects, but of course a lot of new cartoonists and comics are appearing online. And as someone who teaches comics or graphic novels, the only way my students can afford to do a whole course is to buy the ebook version. And I flip-flopped on this, but I was wondering, in terms of the industry now, how do you feel about what the shift to online and digital and electronic versions of graphic novels?
I think it's great. I think the word publish just means to make public. So as soon as you post something on Instagram or wherever, it's published. And so many cartoonists have been serialized online and then collected into great graphic novels, and it builds your audience, and it allows you to reach out to people. You don't have to worry about spending more money on color and print. So I think it's a fabulous thing.
As an artist, I don't know about you guys, but adjusting to like how to make a comic online, how to show it, how to display it versus in a book, it's always been sort of a struggle. The scrolling versus page by page. I don't know how you guys do it. But what's funny is that that's sort of like I made this online comic for Mother magazine, and that just opened up. Opened up doors for me. That's why I'm here today. And but a lot more. It's a lot more accessible, and it's so that I think that's cool and a lot more immediate, and serialized too. It's a new kind of floppy comic type of thing where you can keep on doing issue and issue, because Craig, you're doing that with your series. So I think it's just a great, more accessible way for us to read more comics, and for these guys to draw more comics every week.
Craig?
I don't have much experience with digital comics. I think it is the way, especially if you're a young cartoonist, it's the obvious way to get out there and put it out there free, and those people who, like the digital cartoonists are much bigger names than us, because they have readerships of millions, But me personally, I haven't really consumed comics that way. I'm starting this new series that's serialized because I guess I still like objects. That's why I like books. I think what most people here are fetishizing of the actual object of books too, and going to pals and being able to handle things and look at different book covers. So I'm glad it exists, but I'm still kind of fighting it in certain ways. And I feel bad when you say that thing about your students and that the ebooks are way cheaper. I get that, and I think it would be cool. The ideal is like a lot of those web cartoonists that have put all their stuff up for free, then go on to sell millions of copies of the collections. So there is a format where both of those work.
Thanks. Peter?
I've had very limited experience with doing work online. There's only a handful of things I've done that were specifically to be seen online or online first. Except I regularly do features, these 4-page journalistic comic strips for Reason magazine, and they first appear in print, and their circulation is 50, 60,000, and I might hear from one or two people who read it in the magazine, but then eventually they'll put it up online. They're all up online, and then it's suddenly seen by 1,000 times as many people, and so I have 1,000 times as many people telling me I'm an idiot. But yeah, obviously the reach with the internet, you reach way more people.
Thanks. I think we can open it up now to audience questions, and I hope you'll have questions for either individual cartoonists or 2, 3, or 4. We want to use the mic, so I'll run around with it, and maybe you can use this one. Whoa! I was told not to do that. Sorry.
I can't beat that. I found for myself anyway that reading, starting of course with Maus and some Eisner, and then reading on through the work you do, a deep interest in what was before. So I've started reading backwards, and I'm curious about if that's happened to you, or you are so grounded in the art that you knew at the beginning. But I've been reading all the Gasoline Alley and all that kind of thing, and finding just remarkable commentary and loveliness in that work. Certainly Crazy Cat and all that. Do any of you find yourself going back, say, prior to Eisner, maybe Schultz and so forth, in gaps of the history that you're interested in re-exposing and letting people know about, almost archaeologically?
Well, I did, around the time that I decided I wanted to be a cartoonist, I'd come across, the Smithsonian had those book collections, It'd be like a sampling of these big, thick books that it seemed like everybody read back at that time in the late 70s, early 80s. One was a big Smithsonian collection of newspaper strips, and another was sample comic book stories from the Golden Age. And so that was like that was my first attempt at really going back. And then the work that I found particularly appealing, then I go and try to find book collections of those. But I did a lot. It was a long time ago when I made a huge effort of going back, like you were talking about, and researching the history of comics and seeing what came before. I don't make a habit of doing that now, but I did that rather obsessively back when I started out.
Certainly the books that Peter just mentioned. I'm really right now more interested in looking at artists' work who back then we might not have thought about as cartoonists, because the definition of cartooning has changed so much. In the 30s and 40s, if you weren't doing a newspaper strip or maybe a funny book, you might not have been a cartoonist. And in the history of comics, all these books, they're amazing cartoonists, but it's all dudes, and it's all, it's written, like, the history is written by the industry. It's a commercial medium. And I'm interested in looking at, like, Native American ledger drawings from the 1860s. Everything about those, or they're sequential. They look like family circus strips, and that they were bound in these books. They were really American graphic novels, but they, were torn out the pages and sold to collectors, and we don't think of them in this tradition. Or artists like Charlotte Solomon, and the list goes on. People like Ollie Harrington, Virginia Lee Burton, Marie Hall Etz, children's book creators who really thought about book design and created panels. This is kind of this shadow history of cartooning, and I'm really into kind of like reclaiming them as part of our tradition and thinking of our field as being more diverse than what the history books have kind of presented to us. And that's, again, not to throw away the people like Frank King and all the greats that have come before, but I think there's more to the story than that.
Mine is more of finding Filipino and Filipino Americans in cartoon in comics. I like looking back at some of the artwork that Alfred Akala, during the 70s and doing superhero comics, like knowing that there was like a whole string of Filipino artists doing that at that time, but also slice of life comics by Lou Alcala, and just trying to see more women of color too, like Maine Kubu's, comic when she was in a Japanese internment camp. She did drawings while she was there, like finding those people of color in the comics world, and still like doing more research on it. So, but just being able to find that is always just so empowering, just to see that they're everyone's doing it.
I don't know if I have anything to add. I like what everyone else said, and like James was saying, it's always like right now I'm reading Frida Kahlo's diaries, where she's illustrated throughout, and so as soon as he said that, I definitely have been reading that as a graphic novel, essentially, because it's writing and drawing and colors all at once. And a lot of authors did a lot of their own drawing and mark making, or painters made their own written stories. So just finding the actual comics that have been happening all along, just weren't labeled that way.
I'm curious to know what you guys think about the recently listed Man Booker graphic novel Sabrina by Nick Dernazzo, because I'm still haunted by that, especially because they did a piece on him in the New Yorker, and he said that he originally had the graphic death of Sabrina in there, and then he took it out. But I'm wondering, does that resonate among cartoonists like it does among people who are just readers?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I'll lead with a criticism of the book. I love that book, but like the visual style wasn't inviting to me at first glance. And I think I've heard other people say that, like maybe if they're not initiated to Chris Ware's comics or something, it might look in weird ways like it was drawn by a computer.
Yeah.
But then as soon as within a page or two, it's completely immersive and very disturbing.
Yeah.
And really captures the zeitgeist of our like sort of cultural like whatever landscape right now in America especially. So very haunting.
Yeah, I thought he's such a brilliant use of the medium to create like dread. I mean, he'll just have his characters at the beach, and you're standing at the beach, but everything he's done with the panels and page design, you're just like waiting for the other shoe to drop. There's a sense of dread that he creates with the color, and I see what you mean. Like his drawing is not sensual at all, but then you enter into it and it becomes almost hypnotic, and it's amazing to see that work being recognized and very much well deserved.
Well, I agree with everything you said. I got nothing to add.
I'm going to come up here so the people who are in the front don't necessarily get all the questions.
Thank you. Hi, Peter. I'm Valerie Boyd. I wrote the biography of Zora Neale Hurston. So we had some exchange. Yeah, good to see you. So my question is for all of you, actually. You all seem to identify mostly as cartoonists, even though you also are writers. So, but you seem to identify as artists. So, what are the opportunities that you see, or would you be open to collaborating with a writer like me, who's not an artist, but I love the graphic novel form and would love to work with an artist? I'm sure there are other writers here at AWP who might want to do the same thing. Have you considered that? Have you looked into relationships with writers who might want to? I'm thinking of you, especially like some Filipino American writers whose stories you could help illustrate. If you all could talk about that a little bit, that would be great.
No, I'm always like open to it. I always see myself as a cartoonist first, as the artist first. So I'm always, cartooning is such a, and I guess writing too is such a singular, solitary job a lot of the time, and I do like the collaboration, that whole process of of working as a team. I think I've done it one time when I was an artist, and working with a writer for a newspaper. It was like a comics, a special comics edition, and I don't know about you guys, but if it was like a right fit, yeah, totally.
I have for a while, like 20 or so years ago, I almost made a point of collaborating with other people. Sometimes with me as the writer and somebody else would draw it, and also vice versa. And I enjoyed doing that, and I made a point of doing it mainly to see how especially when somebody would draw something I wrote, I just wanted to see how other artists would approach it, and if I could learn something from it. Also assuming that person, their style would be more appropriate to stories that I've done. I haven't done any, I can't think offhand of any collaborating I've done recently, but I'm not against it. It all depends on the project.
Yeah, I've written things for other people, but drawing somebody else's work, I'm just such a slow drafts person that I don't know if I could do it justice or be able to dedicate the amount of time that it would take. Drawing comics is really slow, grinding work, and I'm probably for all of us, there's like stories we're so passionate to tell that kind of taking on someone else's, trying to help shape someone else's vision can be challenging. So I don't. It's not on a. Sometimes I get the writers I collaborate usually are dead, and they're really easy to collaborate with. They never give me any flack or anything.
I think I'm somewhere between everyone else. It's appealing to me because it is such an isolating sort of like lifestyle being a cartoonist, where you're just writing and drawing graphic novels for years. So very enticed by the idea of collaboration, like Rita said, if it was the right fit, and it would have to be a writer that, that would have to give up a lot of, their language, really. So like all my favorite writers, I'm like, well, how does that writer work if you remove the language, you know? But I'm a longtime fan of Lori Moore. I've always wanted to reach out to her. We have like a kind of overlap in terms of what neck of the woods we come from, and because she works a lot in the shorter stories, I think like poetry and shorter stories, those are going to be the formats, because a short story becomes a graphic novel once you illustrate it and have to put all the other details in. You couldn't adapt a long form novel ever, probably.
I think most cartoonists that I've talked to are approached by writers or companies about, well, I have a script I want you to do, and I think I try to explain that it's kind of like it's a visual medium, like a movie, and the last person they want on a movie set is the writer, right? It's a movie belongs to the director, and I think the cartoonists are the directors. So sometimes, like, if you're not a visual creator, it's a bit of an unbalanced collaboration, and if the writer doesn't understand that, then it could be a little problematic.
Hi. So I guess my question is, in thinking about comics and graphic novels as a literary form, when we think of literary fiction and prose, it has to do a lot with the psychology of character or person and place, more so than it has to do with plot. Do you guys find that to be the same thing in the way that you write your workbooks in a literary graphic novel as opposed to more linear or plot-driven comics?
Definitely. I have never really thought about plot in my books at all, except for I did a kid's sci-fi adventure book. That was one of my more recent projects, and that by nature was more traditional plot-driven storytelling and joke-driven too. But otherwise, yeah, plot is the least interesting or compelling element of storytelling for me.
Yeah.
I guess. A lot of the inspiration from what I write is definitely about place and about I just drew about being in Pennsylvania or and also that's part of the whole thing with comics is that you create this place like visually, like it's just something that you have to just create to begin with, and but yeah, for me specifically, it's always about creating this mood, creating how is this place drive the story, because a lot of the times it is the place where I'm at that is driving the plot in itself. So
I agree with that.
Well, with most stories, there'll be that I write. There's a point to it. Of course, there's a point to why you were writing it, but I do dwell over the plot. The plot is, I want it to have a beginning, middle, and end, just so that a reader will stick with it all the way to the end, and also when they come to the end, it'll feel at least somewhat satisfied. Ends are a real struggle. Sometimes there's been so many times where I thought that was a terrific ending or a logical ending, but the readers had a very different opinion. So you never know. But yeah, I do. Even though it's not a plot, isn't the reason why I've ever written a story. It's something that I sweat over through the whole process. Trying again just to keep the reader engaged and keep turning the page.
Yeah, and I'd agree with Peter that the ending is kind of the most crucial. Not because it's like an ending, it's just like the moment you're handing the baton off to the reader, because the story continues, but it's in the reader's imagination. I mean, that's what makes any story stick with you, is that you're still engaging with it on your own level.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just like building energy in the story and then releasing it to the reader, and you want to try to bring that thing into a landing.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Hi. So for writers who work with just text, there's a lot of conversation about how far along your work should be before you show it to anyone or start pitching it. For cartoonists or creators of graphic novels when the art can be something that takes months or years after the story itself is like set in your mind? How would you approach that, or at what stage in the process would you approach that?
It's a good question. I think if you're a beginning, or is a beginning cartoonist trying to get in the scene, you kind of still have to finish something to get the attention of an editor or agent or anything. You do have advantages because it's visual, so they can flip open to one page and know if they're going to sit with it for even another second. So you have this power to grab someone's attention faster than with prose. But I think you're still expected to finish the story because they don't know how you function as a storyteller, since the drawing is only not even half of the power of it all. So.
And even in your question, you said how long till you show it or pitch it, and those are like two different things. Like you can show work to get feedback and to make the work better, and then pitching it seems like you're trying to sell it to somebody, and if you don't feel like the soup is ready, why try to pitch it? So I guess there's the difference there as well.
Oh, she's climbing up there. I just have one little thing, and for that question, I guess it's like I come from like the DIY thing, so it's always been like just make the book, just write the story out, and then I mean, if you know what's happening, you know what you're gonna be, you know what it's gonna be, you should just at least write it for yourself, and then take it to these conventions, and I don't know if you do any if you do zines or you self-publish. I don't know, but I know you're done, right? But that's just sort of how I did it. Like I just kept just making comics and had built up a body of work, and then I guess it's because I'm not very driven at all, and I'm just very self-deprecating. Like, would you like this? And they're like, Raina, you've been doing this for years. So just building a body of work, and then finding your style through that, and so that they also understand what your style is too, and I think that's just even a great exercise just to be able to complete a story and feel like you've produced something,
So you've all talked about how you're physical artists, and all of your mediums are physical. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or opinions about illustration softwares and how people. I seem to read a lot of webcomics, and a lot of those artists talk about their use of digital medium, and I was wondering if you had thoughts or opinions on that.
I don't know, James, do you do any digital stuff?
My work's like a cyborg. I draw it on watercolor paper, and then I scan it in, and then I enhance digitally. But it's just a tool. It's just a tool, and a lot of people are using Procreate now on the iPad, and what is it, Clip Studio? That used to be Manga Studio, and Photoshop. The computer doesn't tell you what to do. You tell the computer what to do. So I don't have a strong opinion. If I like the comic, I like the comic. I mean, someone like Rutu Modan, this Israeli cartoonist who I adore, when she told me she does everything digitally, I found it so hard to believe because the work was so warm and felt so personal, and she just looked at me in this forthright Israeli way and said, I am in charge of the computer. It is not in charge of me. And I've kind of taken that with me when I think about my attitude towards tools.
So we have 5 minutes left, and I actually want to ask each of our panelists to tell us what they're doing next, so we know what to look out for. And Greg, you've told us kind of what you're doing next. Is there anything else on the horizon, or do you want to talk about how that might become a book, the 12-part comic?
So I'm doing this book, this serialization of ginseng roots, and there'll be at least 3 issues out this year. It's bi-monthly, and it's outlined to be 12 issues, so it'll be at least that. possibly more, but I'm trying to force myself to work within that constraint of 32-page issues or chapters. And I'm excited to do serialization, again, because of the isolation of doing a graphic novel, but also it's nonfiction, it's very research-based, and so there's going to be lots of fact-checking and getting things wrong. And now people can criticize my work while it's still malleable, while it's still useful for me. Otherwise, you work on a book for years, and people are like, you got that wrong. You're like, oh, okay. So now it'll actually be like, I'll have this freedom to revise whatever is serialized. And in a way, it makes the serialization cool because it can be separate from the collective work because things will be reworked and edited.
So we'll see how this goes, but I'm trying to do this film noir fiction novel that is based on the immigration experience, the Filipino immigration experience in the Bay Area in the 1930s, and there's no color involved at all. It's all black and white film noir and following sort of this Hollywood. It sounds amazing. It's all just Filipino characters in sort of this film noir Hollywood genre.
I'm editing a couple books right now on Charlotte Bronte and Harriet Tubman, and then a book about called "This Is What Democracy Looks Like: A Graphic Guide to Governance," which is self-explanatory. And then on my own stuff that I'm writing and drawing, I'm just kind of nibbling around the edges of something that's not even worth talking about yet.
Officially, my next project is it's going to be a memoir about my late brother who died over 20 years ago. And it's basically, it's a memoir about me and him, our relationship. And it's an idea it's something I've wanted to do ever since he passed away. But I'm still, and I even have it written, but it's the whole idea of doing it is somewhat torturous. I'm still very afraid to do it. I'm constantly questioning myself as to why I'm doing it. And I thought when I wrote it, I thought that the why would answer itself in the script. And my wife read it and she loved it. But then she goes, "No, this is great." But I'm like, "Why do you think it's great? Do you have any idea why I'm writing this?" I have no idea, except that it's a notion in my head that won't go away. So for that reason, I guess, maybe I'll never understand it, but I might just do it anyway. Other than that, I'm still doing regular features for Reason Magazine. Just real quick, when you were talking about serializing something, that is great, and that's something that so many literature figures, fiction writers just do very frequently, is to write a novel in serial form. Charles Dickens, and most famously, and Arthur Conan Doyle, and they also loved the feedback. So, like when it would finally come out as a novel, there would be tweaking that they did from for each installment, and the tweak would be the result of feedback they get from the readers. And of course, a lot of feedback is just noise, it's garbage, but sometimes somebody will say something that's like, "Oh, yeah, that's an excellent idea." So there is that, and that's something I hated about switching from comic books to graphic novels, is spending years working on something that nobody sees, and it's 3 years of wondering, is anybody gonna like this? What is anybody gonna make of it? So, sorry to end on not answering your question.
Yes, what was that about imposter syndrome, James? So we're out of time. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. The Drawn and Quarterly booth is right behind where you're sitting, and of course the artists' work are there, and some of the works they mentioned too, like Sabrina, and they will be around. Yeah, and they're all signing over there too. So thank you to everyone coming, and thank you to our panelists.
All right, so now let's jump over to the Teaching Comics in College panel with Sara Leavitt, Jennifer Mervin, and Sandy Longhorn.
Welcome to Teaching Comics in Creative Writing Programs. I am not an imposter, but I do not have my badge because did you see the registration lineup this morning? Oh my God. So, I just realized that if I stopped to get my badge and my tote bag and all the cool stuff, I would not make it to my own panel. So, but I am Sara Leavitt, and I do teach comics classes in the creative writing program at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. So our panel, you might be wondering where the two men are. We got rid of them. No, they were not able to join us today, unfortunately. But so the good thing is that as opposed to just more moderating, I'm going to talk a whole bunch because now I have time. So yeah, we'll make it work. Our slides are a little smaller than we wish they were. And I texted the AV person, but I think it will work. There are seats up front if anybody's and in the middle, but it's okay if you want to hover. It's good because you have to find out whether we're going to be interesting or not. And I don't know.
We will be.
We will be. Okay. We have slides. Even if you think that what we're saying isn't that interesting, we're going to show you pictures of student work, which is basically the best thing about any conference, right? And I think I'll just take this opportunity to say that this is one of the reasons why we're so excited about teaching comics, because every time you come to class and you know that you're going to see other people's work, there's this like flutter of excitement inside you because you're like, I get to see pictures that other people drew. And I haven't met a student yet who isn't extremely excited about that. So I just want to say a few words about who's up here. So as I said, I'm the moderator of the panel. My name is Sara Leavitt. I teach comics at UBC. I teach undergrad lecture classes as well as MFA and BFA workshops. And I'm also a cartoonist. I wrote a memoir many years ago called Tangles, a story about Alzheimer's, my mother and me. And my second book is coming out in the fall. It's a kind of horror / historical fiction. It's called Agnes Murderess. And with me, I have Jennifer Mervin, or Jen Mervin. Her writing and graphic narrative have been published in The Sun, American Short Fiction, The Florida Review, Bellingham Review, Cincinnati Review, Catamaran, and many other publications. And she's a faculty member at Missouri State University, and she has an MFA from Pacific University. And then we have Sandy Longhorn, who's the author of 3 books of poetry, most recently, The Alchemy of My Mortal Form. She teaches in the Arkansas Writers MFA program at the University of Central Arkansas, and she directs the CD Write Women Writers Conference. So I'm super excited to have you guys here today. So the reason that we're doing this panel is believe me, I won't tell you my whole life history, but I just wanted to say that when I was doing my MFA at UBC, in the same program where I'm now teaching, about 12 years ago, my mom was dying of Alzheimer's, and my idea with going into the MFA was that I wanted to do a prose book about her death and my family's experience. And while there, I started creating comics, and I was in my mid-30s, and I fell in love with comics and just started doing them even though I didn't really know how. So that's kind of the short version of how I came into doing comics. And I feel like that's kind of influenced how I teach. I am really convinced that comics can be a good thing for anybody to do, whether or not they can or can't draw, and we'll talk more about that. So I've been teaching comics classes at UBC since 2012, and I started wondering who else was doing that. So I posted in the Creative Writing Pedagogy group on Facebook and got some replies from people like Jen and Sandy, and we started talking about doing this panel. So we've been writing back and forth for probably almost a year, exchanging emails with lots of exclamation marks and also super professional theory. And so, yeah, since 2012, I've just been really overwhelmed by the quality of the work that students create in my classes, whether they're coming in as experienced artists or whether they're coming in as people who are like, I'm actually thinking that I'm not going to take your class because you're going to make us draw and I can't draw. Or like students who are like, when I first came to your class, I thought I was going to have a panic attack because you were going to make me draw. And those people go on to make really fantastic comics. So yeah, we are 3 instructors with different backgrounds, teaching different classes, and we are all smitten with comics. I just will say a quick note about terminology. Probably each of us will just say something about what we call what we do. I basically just call all the work that I'm doing and that my students are creating comics, not graphic novel, not, even though the courses I teach are called graphic forms, I never call it that. I just call everything comics, basically because it's easy and because if you know that there's lots of debate within comics about what to call them. And I tend to agree with people like Marjane Satrapi, who wrote Persepolis, who's just like, I'm not going to call my stuff a graphic novel. It's not fancy. It is work that is accessible to tons of different people. It's comics. Don't try to dress it up. So with that, I think what we're going to do today, so if you're just coming in, there's lots of seats. You're more than welcome to stand if that's your thing, but if it's not, feel free to come in and take a seat. If you need an accessibility copy of our outline, just raise your hand and somebody will bring it to you. What we're going to do is we're going to take turns talking about what we do at our universities. And then we're going to talk about why we think it's important to teach comics within creative writing programs. And then we're going to talk about ideas that you can take back into your own schools and potentially do there. Okay, so Sandy's going to start.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for choosing our panel. I'm just going to tell you right now that the imposter syndrome is raging hardcore in me because I am the person up here who came to teaching comics as just a poet. Just. No, I know, right? Right? Stop. So I was hired at the University of Central Arkansas in the fall of 2015. We have a very interesting situation there in the fact that our creative writing program is not housed with our English department. It's not housed with our composition and rhetoric program. We are in the Department of Film, Theater, and Creative Writing. If you want to buy me a beer, I can tell you all about why that is, but drama. Anyway, theater. As such, in the state of Arkansas, we offer the only Bachelor of Arts in creative writing. There's another school that offers a BFA in creative writing, but it's within an English department, and those students have to meet all of those other English course requirements as well. So the number of hours that they can devote to creative writing is lessened. Our undergraduate students take 36 hours of creative writing. And then we also have a very new MFA program. So if you know anybody out there looking for an MFA, stop by booth 6066, self-promotion, to come and talk to us about it. So when I was hired, everyone who teaches in our program has to have dual genres, as is the case now in academia. And there I was, a poet. But I had spent about 10 years self-teaching myself collage art. And a lot of times I blended words with images in those collages. And that was my little tiny toe into the door to say, yes, I'll teach your course in illustrated narrative. Sure. So at our school, the course is called Illustrated Narrative when we were talking about what things are called. But it's a course that occurs for a single semester, and I'm just going to read you all the course description so you can see the breadth of what this course does. This course provides students with a comprehensive overview of the formal elements of illustrated and interactive narratives, with an emphasis on the study of comic art, collage, computer-generated projects, literary works accompanied by visual art or photography, gaming storylines, installations, and other forms of illustrated interactive narratives. Whoa. And so the way we approach that, also, our students take a forms class that's a single semester, and then they can take a workshop class that's a single semester. And shout out to my student, Quaid, who is here and knows so much more about comics than I do. The professor who created this course went on to become our dean. So we have a lot of support from the administration down. And he said, just, teach to your strengths and what the students want. So I ended up teaching the course. 1/3 of the course is comics, 1/3 is writing for video games. I've never even played Mario. Imposter! And 1/3 is 3D art that blends illustration and narrative, and that's where I feel really good. So I did a lot of self-education very quickly. I read a lot, and I guess I'm here to tell you all that if you are interested in this at all, but you feel like I could never propose this course or I could never say that I wanted to teach it, yes, you can. And you can actually integrate comics into your regular creative writing classes, which I know we're going to talk about later on. A couple of things about how I teach the course. I'm the only one without slides. Because my students, because we only get 6 weeks to look at comics, we actually don't do full production. We instead work as if in the real world we were simply writers without going to the step of contacting our artist. So we write comic scripts, and we use this wonderful website. It's called comicsexperience.com, and that's comics with a CS, not an X. Comicsexperience.com/scripts. It's the comic book script archive. And there are numerous scripts there. So we read those. We read comics. We read Monstrous, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend. We read scripts for other comics, and we look at thumbnails that other writers have used. And then my students generate scripts with thumbnails. So even if they can't draw, no big deal. They're, like me, stick figures. In fact, the students who struggle the most in the class are my art students who are in the class, and that's because they don't have enough time to do the art the way they want it to be. And so I actually limit them and say, no, you need to turn in just regular thumbnails, and if you want to do one page of full panels of what it's going to look like, you go for it. But because it's a split class, we just have to limit it. The other thing, so we read Monstrous, or at least that's what we've been reading, and then we also read Fun Home. And I get a lot of really good response out of that. I think some students are intimidated because they think they have to know all the superhero stuff. And so if we don't go that route, people feel more comfortable. And many of them have never experienced nonfiction in graphic form. And so I'll just tell you briefly, I use Michael Bendis's Words for Pictures. I use Matt Madden's 99 Ways to Tell a Story, which I really recommend. I use a book called Over the Line, An Introduction to Poetry Comics by Tom Humberstone and Chrissy Williams. And if you need to email me to get that list, I'm at slonghorn@uca.edu, and I'll be happy to send that to you. Okay, and now I think Jennifer's going to talk about what she does.
Okay, hi. I might take my heels off. I'll lose 3 inches.
Super short.
Well, I'm just posing as a tall person.
Really nice shoes, too.
They're cute. Okay, so, hi, my name is Jennifer Mervin, and I hail from Springfield, Missouri at Missouri State University, where I teach in the creative writing program, and I'm so excited to see like a whole group of my students over there, so shout out to them. And 2 of them I am featuring in my PowerPoint, so you can praise them later. I did my graduate work. I did my MA before I did an MFA later. And in my Master of Arts, my focus was literature. And I decided that I wanted to focus my graduate work on comics. And I loved it. I was introduced to a lot of underground comics. So my love was, Harvey Pekar, Harvey Kurtzman, a lot of those, sort of underground, getting into graphic memoir, getting into political comics. So I read A Contract with God. It changed my life at 22. I loved it. So when I went on to get my full-time faculty job, part of my sort of pitch when I did my interview was saying I wanted to bring comics into the program. And, I think I was expecting everyone to sort of be like, no, but everyone was super excited about it. And I think it's a great time to be in comics. It's a great time to be a scholar and a writer. It's a great time to be publishing. So I loved it, and it was really welcomed in my department. My proposal was passed. They did make me do an intercession course at first, just to sort of see how that would roll. It was a 1-week intercession course, and I had 45 students enroll. And it was very intimidating because I had never taught a class in comics. So I taught Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which is a great text. And it is the first book that I always teach in all of my comics classes. And I make students reread it if they've already read it, because I have taught it now for 7 years, and I still get something out of it every time I teach it. So I get nervous speaking, so I wrote down everything I would like to share with you on this handout right here. So make sure you come and grab it. In 2016, I wanted to expand my program. My intercession course, I did that twice. It became a full semester course, sort of in the 200 level of our sort of 3-track creative writing courses in our undergrad department. And then I had a bunch of graduate students audit it, which was very exciting. So I wanted to expand it. And my dear friend and colleague, Cole Klosser, who couldn't be here, which makes me sad, and he's also a great artist himself, who teaches in the art and design department at Missouri State University, we proposed an interdisciplinary course. So those of you that teach in academia probably can anticipate the issues that we encountered. Who's going to pay for it? Which department's going to pay for it? Are you going to teach half the time and they teach half the time, and then we pay you half and we pay them half? And we were like, no, we want to teach all the courses, both of us in the room together. So it was very tricky to sort of figure out where the credit hours would be housed, who would pay for it. So the way that we ended up doing it was we did a cross-listed course, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about that if you want to know how that worked out. But it ended up being great. I do mention in my handout that we have a little bit of enrollment issue with that. Sometimes the class is very large because we have to sort of open the same amount of seats. But it was great, and that class has just been a complete joy. We teach it as an art seminar, so it's a 2-hour, 45-minute course twice a week in the spring semester typically. So it's nice because students can really sink into the process like when we're there. And we really co-teach the class. I teach the writing part of it, and we sort of cross over as needed. Cole's a great writer. He teaches the art and illustration and design and Photoshop, which still I can't figure out, but I get help, so that's nice. So yeah, that's a little bit about my course. The nice thing about the interdisciplinary course is that it draws students from art and design and English together in the same room, and they can sort of pick what credit hours they need for their major. And it's been a fabulous recruiting technique for our creative writing program because they get so excited. They never thought they were writers, and I think Cole and I think you mentioned this, it's so interesting because artists are typically the easiest ones to teach to write. And the writers are the easiest ones to teach to draw. So it's really kind of a fun and beautiful eclectic experience in the classroom. So yeah, should I go ahead and show my slides then? Okay, well, fabulous. So this work is from my interdisciplinary course. My intro class that I teach in the creative writing program, it's a literature and writing course, and we don't draw in that course either. My students read a lot. We talk about craft, and then they do a workshop script where they choose either a short story, a graphic short story, or a graphic essay, and then we workshop it, and then we I have a layout sort of the assignments on my handout. We also do a scholarly component where I have students complete an independent reading and then give a little mini presentation craft talk on something that we've talked about in class, like panel-to-panel pacing or point of view or dramatic irony or, a particular thing that we've talked about in class. So that work is pretty exciting too, just in a different way. This is from my interdisciplinary course. We divide the course up into 4 projects, so 4 weeks per project, and then the 5th project is an expansion and revision of one of the projects. We have experimented with different projects over the semesters, and this is sort of what we've landed on that's worked the best. So I'll just kind of walk you through. The first project we do is a memoir project, and the craft issue in the writing portion is the Vivian Gornick's fabulous situation in the story, which I love. So we talk a little bit about, housing your memoir in an experience, and then talking about sort of a larger thematic issue. This is my student, Maddie Cushman, and she utilizes, I wrote down there very small, the dervish essay form, which is sort of a breathless, kind of long, run-on sentence lyric essay. And so she's writing about sort of coming of age. I didn't include the whole comic, just a few sort of sample panels for you. She published this in Barrel House, and that magazine has been really beautiful to my students. They've published 2 of my students, and then one of my students actually submitted an illustration to their cover and was on their cover. That's a great magazine, I think. So this is her beautiful comic. You can sort of see her dervish style. This is my student Ariel Messerer. She's utilizing a little bit of collage in this piece. This is also a memoir where she's sort of using a metaphor of being a beekeeper for the fact that she's the secret keeper sort of in her family. And so you can see her use of a photograph there in the top right corner. And her beautiful lettering. She was influenced a lot by Linda Berry, who's a writer that I use a lot in my teaching. This is my student Olivia Libby, and this is from our exercise in peripheral narration where she's looking at her grandmother. So they start out with graphite, and then, it's a lot of our writers that are just kind of performing with comics, they sort of stick with graphite for a lot of it. We do have them do inking as well. Project 2 is Culture of Place, where I use the cultural iceberg for this. If you haven't used this for teaching, oh my gosh, it's the best. Just Google cultural iceberg, and it's wonderful. It's a great way for students to access characterization and culture of place, because it talks about sort of above the iceberg, we have things like language and dress, and below it's belief structures and attitudes toward generations and aging. It's just a fabulous teaching technique. So out of this, we get some beautiful writing. And then here, this is our project where we talk about fumetti or collage. So fumetti is the Italian sort of photo comic. So this is my student Amanda Hadlock, who's here. Amanda, she's right there. So this is Amanda's beautiful collage essay where she's utilizing monologue and fumetti. And this was recently published in Hobart. So that was pretty exciting. You can find that full text online. This is my student Olivia Libby. Again, this is her photo comic. Again, about rural Missouri, where here she's sort of talking about living on a farm and attitude towards animals and birth and all of that. This is my student Brandon Hughes writing about sort of being the only Black kid at his school growing up in Southwest Missouri, rural Missouri. You can see here a totally different style. He's a creative writing major, as is Amanda. Here he did a lot of research about the history of Missouri, Springfield, Missouri. That was part of the Culture of Place assignment as well, was doing research about your hometown. Project 3 is the genre of magical realism, which I personally really love. And this was a fun one. We have students utilize the lore and the mythology of where they grew up. So I have them sort of look into urban legend, lore, mythology. If not from the region, then maybe from their own sort of historical, or their where they come from, the traditions in their family. So I had several students do some amazing work. This is Schmetterling. I'm totally not pronouncing that correctly. Anyone German in here that can pronounce that correctly? Okay, I'm just going to leave it up there for you. This is my student Chandler. She did this beautiful comic where it's a couple where the husband has Alzheimer's and the wife is sort of watching him fade away, and one day she finds him covered in butterflies, and then he exits the window. It's a really beautiful comic. This is my student Jenny, who's also here. So Jenny chose to do her magical realism story from her hometown of Joplin, Missouri, which suffered a terrible tornado, horrible tragedy. It killed a lot of people in 2011, and there is a local legend of butterfly people. This has been going on for ages and generations in Southwest Missouri. You can ask Jenny more about this. And she chose to write about the Joplin tornado utilizing the first-person plural point of view, which was our sort of craft lecture for that project. And our last is science fiction, and we utilize Ursula Le Guin's great essay, Introduction to Science Fiction. You can find that full text online. It's a fabulous little, very teachable essay where she talks about science fiction is not about the future, it's about the present. So we had students sort of think about anxieties that they have towards technology in this day and age. This was my student, Stephen Ward. I love this because look at this. This is stick figures. You know what I mean? This was our first student to ever publish in a national journal. He got this published in the Florida Review because it's a really haunting story about isolation. It's about a couple and the guy gets tired of the noise of the world and the marketing, and he chooses to go and live on this planet, but he misses, his love, and they just sort of separate. It's a beautiful story. And we like to show this to students who are very intimidated by doing art. It's like, look at this. It's about story. It's about moving people. And then this is my student Maddie again, sort of writing about a societal relocation program where he gets the opportunity to relocate to a nonverbal community. And you can see part of the ending here. She's utilizing a lot of our lessons on pacing. Here you have sort of moment-to-moment panel transitions to show a slowing down or a pause. And then you can see she writes in sign language, I'm still lonely. That's what that says. So I'm happy to talk more afterward, but I feel like I've already gone super long. So I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah.
There's so many shoes up here. For you guys that are standing at the back, please feel free to come and sit down. I'm just switching over to my slideshow, so you're not interrupting anything. See all these seats, but then you have to commit and you can't leave. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do teaching comics at UBC Creative Writing. And I think I just saw my colleague Taylor Brown Evans. Hi, Taylor. Taylor also teaches comics classes at UBC. So I just wanted to say briefly, I chose these images as my first slide, and I've been using this images from this book this term, Blame This on the Boogie by Rena Ayuyang. Has anybody read it? It's this delightful memoir, and she opens with this zooming in on her house, and the first panel is a representation of the screen on her front door, and it says, behind this, usually I can see my slides better, so sorry, but it's something about, behind this is, anger and despair, and then she's in the next page, which is the brightly colored one, she's just kidding, it's just a mess. And the reason that I chose this is because, one of the things I want to talk about is how comics can allow students both to play and be completely silly and ridiculous, and also dive into very difficult personal issues, stories about racism, homophobia, other forms of oppression, stories about grief and loss. And comics have a long history of being able to do those things. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about why I think they're so useful for any creative writing student, whether they're going to go on to make comics or not. It's a way into stories that you cannot access through prose alone. So UBC is a little bit unusual because we have a gigantic creative writing program. So we have our MFA and our BFA programs, which are quite small, and then we have a whole minor program. So these are some students in our introduction to graphic forms. So as I said, all our classes are called graphic forms, but we tend to just call them comics class. So this is students in the 200 level lecture class, which can range from about 60 to about 125 students. Here they are trying to do interactive work in a chemistry classroom, and they're just that's fine, we're just going to sit on the floor and do our comics on flip charts about superheroes. Those students can then go on to take, so that class is a lecture class with lots of hands-on work, and then they can go on to take the 300 level, which is also a lecture / workshop, and these don't have to be these are not creative writing major students. They're minor students who might then go on to go into the BFA. And then we have workshops, which are about 12 to 15 students in our BFA and MFA programs, and that's where the comics classes started. And we've just been kind of developing them and perfecting them as the years have gone on. Our MFA workshop we offer online as well, which is a really cool way of teaching comics that works really well. You just have to be able to upload your images. And then this coming summer, I'm teaching a 2-week comics boot camp. I hate the word boot camp, but then it comes out of my mouth. A 2-week summer intensive for our Optras program. So I just want to talk about some of the things that I do in comics class. And these are basically, most of the examples you'll see, they're either from my 300 level students who are taking a creative writing minor or from my grad students. They're all former students because my current students are creating really amazing work, but I just didn't even want to try to figure out like any potential drama from only choosing some students' works. Not their drama, my drama. So all these things are common to any comics class I teach, no matter what level it is. So we do lots of drawing exercises, we do diary comics, we do focused reading, and we do short autobiographical stories. We do other things too, but these are the things I wanted to talk about because I think that they're they're kind of the core of how I choose to teach. So what is really important to me is that we start drawing right away. So my other co-panelists have mentioned students come into comics class sometimes literally terrified of drawing. Linda Berry, who many of you will know, is a cartoonist and writer about creativity, talks about how we shouldn't talk about how we can't draw. Refer to yourself as somebody who quit drawing, because we all used to draw. When we got to be about 10, we got divided up into good drawers and shitty drawers, and those of us who knew that we couldn't draw just stopped. And I was definitely one of those people. I was used to everybody telling me my drawings were awesome, especially my mom and dad. And then there was some like really stupid art contest that I didn't win, and I was like, that's it. So, low resilience and overly large ego, but that was what happened to me. And so I like to do drawing as much as possible because the more you draw, the less you have to worry about every single drawing you do. If you're doing like 5 drawings every time you come to comics class, who cares if some of them are messes? It doesn't matter. You're generating material that you can then work with. So I like to just like say like drawing is a normal thing. We're going to do it all the time, and you're also going to do it whether you want to or not. So there are definitely always students who are like, I don't want to do the drawing part. And it's sorry. So what happens often is it is the students with fine arts backgrounds who really stress out because you're making them be messy and you're making them be gestural. And they're also used to being very worried about their art. And whereas people who don't draw are like you said, and I love that motion because that's how I talk about my own drawing sometimes. It's like drawing, it does not come easily for me either. So these are students who, during our presentations, so students have to do presentations about comics they've read over the term, and everybody else sits there, and I always have an activity for the students who are not presenting because, if you don't, like, they're just on their phones. So I always make them, like, write or draw while the other people are talking. So these are a million drawings of a student named Minnie. And Minnie is talking about a comic she read called I'm Not Here. And she said that, she's like, the reason I chose this comic is because I had this anthology that Sarah made us buy last year. It was super heavy. And then I opened it to the last comic, and I felt feelings I had never felt before. And I'm like, Minnie, you're killing me. And she loved it because it was about a child of immigrant parents. She had never seen, she is an immigrant from China, and she felt like she had never seen her own life depicted so clearly. And she had never felt that way about prose she'd read. So people are all drawing pictures of Minnie. So like I said, like the drawings become precious and less precious or stressful, but they're still really, students are like, oh, can I see the picture you drew of me? Can I see? What did you draw? And we just always make it really fun. And I wanted to show you, like, these are 2 different students, Andre and Sophie. Andre is a math major who does not draw, or did not draw. His drawing has improved so much since he's taken a couple comics classes now. And you can see that he is maybe less used to drawing than Sophie is. Sophie has a very developed style, and it's very beautiful. It's very influenced by anime, and her drawings tend to be very perfect and precise. And through comics class, she's been able to relax a little bit and focus more on, like, what does Minnie actually look like, as opposed to, like, the regular way that I draw people. So we draw all the time. We also do what I just called for the purpose of this slideshow focused reading. And I love this drawing because her eyes are a little bit crossed as if she's reading very carefully. So this is an example. This is a student named Yulia presenting about her comic. And so they have to pick a comic and study it and study the craft that's involved in the comic. So she's saying difference in line thickness can direct reader attention. So one of the things they have to do is, so I'll back up a little. At the beginning of the term, we read some basic comics theory and craft readings to establish a shared vocabulary. That's part of taking the emphasis off. I can't come to comics class because I don't know how to draw. Well, if what you mean by I don't know how to draw is I can't draw a human with the correct anatomical proportions, that's a tiny part of drawing comics. And maybe, depending on your style, it's no part of comics. So what we focus on is, here are some of the craft elements. So I had a list of recommended reading, and you can ask me for it at the end if you didn't get it. Probably many of you have heard of Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics. His work has been critiqued in the many years since he published it in 93, but it's really important central text for kind of thinking about how and why comics work, what they are and are not. He also did a book that I think is better called Making Comics, where he talks about these are the 5 choices that every cartoonist makes when they sit down to do work, and I think we can apply those choices to any kind of writing. So he talks about you choose the moment you're going to write about, you choose the frame for that moment, you choose your images and your words, and then you choose how the story flows through the comic. So once you start talking about those 5 elements, it doesn't matter whether you can draw, right? You're talking about whether your comic can communicate clearly. So we do those readings at the beginning, and then we read as many comics as possible. So students do short presentations like you do in your class. And the other thing they do is a copying exercise. So in the past, I've made students copy entire pages. It takes hours and hours. We did it with Mouse one term, and then usually it's like the comic of their choice. Now I just do a panel because students can literally spend 4 hours copying even a simple comics panel. What they learn from that is they gain insight into how their beloved cartoonists do their comics. They gain insight into how difficult it can be to do even a simple comic. And they figure out things that they want to apply to their own comics. So when this is a picture of Yulia talking about her copying exercise, and that's how she figured out, if I put some bold lines around things, like that's going to draw the reader's attention more to that part of the picture. So then the other thing that we do is diary comics. A huge influence for me in my teaching is Ivan Brunetti. He wrote an amazing book called Cartooning Philosophy and Practice. It's a very tiny book. I always have to say when I talk about Ivan Brunetti's work that he is like a brilliant teacher, and I just respect him so much as a teacher. A lot of his comics I find misogynist and overly excessively violent, but just don't read them. Just read his book, Cartooning Philosophy and Practice. It's tiny, it's short. You can apply what he says to any form. And he talks a lot about comics as communication, which Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse, also talks about. Comics are about communication. They're not about making beautiful art. So Ivan Brunetti always makes people do Cartooning Philosophy and Practice. I think it's a 14-week comics class that you can kind of do on your own. With my students, depending on the level of the course, I have them do a comic a day for 5 to 7 days. Again, like the drawing exercises in class, it takes away some of the preciousness of drawings. Students start experimenting with things and doing work that they might not otherwise have done. And I talk a lot about myself always, but when I assign diary comics, one of the reasons I do is that I myself, so for a couple of reasons. One is I've used diary comics myself to figure out how to draw and write about things that I didn't know how to draw and write about. So a project that is in process right now is I'm writing about my partner who has very extreme chronic pain. And I wanted to figure out a way to write about that without drawing her body writhing in pain constantly, because that's boring. So I used diary comics as a low pressure way to every night kind of think about how I wanted to draw, and I came up with some abstract images that I use. So I feel like diary comics, they can be something that you publish for sure. I'm going to show you a couple that we published. Sorry, I'm kind of going on, but they can also be a really useful research tool. So it's about collecting. It's about noticing where stories come from for you and what your process is, figuring out style and craft. And at the end of it, it's students do a reflection about their process, and we don't do a workshop about what's working and what's not. So this is an example of Ann Dolman, who did the comic about walking her dog that you just saw, also did this reflection. They had to draw a reflection about what the process was like. So I just want to highlight with my super high tech some of the things she figured out. She just has this list of like things she has to investigate, and then realizing all the things she doesn't know. Her other thing was, she's like, my top 4 realizations. Thumbnails are just the beginning. So thumbnails, for those who don't know, are the very rough sketches that you do when you're figuring out your comic. She needs time. Like, a lot of students who do the diary comics are not cartoonists, and they don't want to be cartoonists, but they figure out stuff about their poetic process or their novel writing process. They're like, oh, right, I need time every day to do my craft. And she's like, comics remind me of poetry. And I'll just show you, I'll kind of go through these quickly, but this is another cartoonist, a master's student named Ann Denning. And she was not somebody who was used to drawing, but she just started picking out things that were happening to her. And this is a comic about how this other woman in her building caught her smoking, and it made her think about why she was smoking and what it was about. And the woman, she's terrified of this woman, and the woman's like, you're smoking. And she's like, is she judging me, or is she just kind of narrating what I'm doing? And so she has this beautiful panel at the end where the woman's picking up her small dog's poop, and she's like, you are cleaning up after your small dog. Yeah. And then, but what's really exciting is that was the beginning of her week of diary comics. This is the end of the week. So Anne is experimenting here with a totally different panel arrangement. She is meditating on this quote about how, the mind is unfamiliar territory. She's like, my mind is not unfamiliar territory. I'm in the same rut all the time. But she's using, she's a poet, and she's using metaphorical images, and just kind of, she can tell, I think, that she feels a lot less stiff than she did in her first drawing. And I just want to show you 2 other diary comics. I have a student named Alyssa Hirose, who you can follow on Instagram at Hi Alyssa Comics. And she did not do comics at all. She's a BFA student. And then she just forced herself after comics class to start doing a comic every day. So I'm going to show you this in large. So this is about adulthood. So adulthood is chasing her. And then it says, sorry, I can't read right now. You still need to get your bike that you left at school 4 months ago. Also, you're moving in 2 weeks and you haven't even thought about packing. Please stop. You have no clean underwear. Yeah. So that was in, I think comics class ended in August, and I think that, or in April, and then that was a comic she did in August, and this is one that she did in December. And I think you can see, so she started drawing digitally, she's adding color, she's experimenting with form. So she, if I want to dissolve my bath bomb, do my face mask, and still not be freezing, I better run a really hot bath. So you can see, I'm going to talk about a little bit about how comics can help you get into big issues. Not necessarily, right? So she gets in her bath, and she said her whole focus during this comic was how to draw a comic about being in the bathtub, knowing that her family follows her on Instagram, and she doesn't want to be naked. And then she just did this panel, which I think is fantastic. And this is what students can do once they get more familiar with the form, is start using the form itself. So she's following in the footsteps of cartoonists throughout time, like Ernie Bushmiller, who did Nancy, or lots of newspaper cartoonists who actually are using the panel borders as a part of the comic. And she's like, yes, this is really cool how long I drew my arms and legs, but the main motivation was my mom not seeing my naked body. So yeah, so that's Alyssa. And I just gonna quickly go talk about one last thing that we do, which is short autobiographical comics. This is a comic by a student in my 300 level class named Carmela de Torres, who wrote about her mom. She and her brother are both gay, and her mom kind of talking about Moonlight winning an Academy Award and how it won even though the people in the movie are freaks. And Carmela's like, wait a minute, why are they freaks? And kind of has this bizarre conversation with her mom about how gays and lesbians are freaks, even though her mom knows that her kids are gay. So autobiography works really well as a starting place for stories instead of having students get into like big sci-fi or fantasy or whatever their kind of initial instinct often is with comics. Start with your own stories, and students are often able to explore difficult material for the first time or in a new way. And that includes stuff around race and gender identity and everything. I'm just going to show you one other thing, just because I'm really proud of what I did with the slide. But this is just one other diary comic. It's about this girl smoking for the first time in high school, and she's gone through this whole thing. Basically, the comic is about pretending that she smokes even though she doesn't, to impress this guy, and she ends up throwing up at the end. And darts is slang for cigarettes, which I didn't know before this. But I just popped up one of the panels because it says, yeah, I'm McIntyre, I'm 15, I got kicked out of school for putting a dude in a coma. And when we saw this panel, the class just broke down laughing and could not stop. And I feel like it was because she took this guy named McIntyre who's saying this horrible thing. He's very little. He's sitting in a swing and his feet aren't touching the ground. And so many of us instantly recognized guys that we knew in high school. And there was something about that I think only comics could do. So we're going to talk briefly about a couple of things. One is why we teach comics and in creative writing, or why we think that's a good idea, and some ideas for exercises that you can do, and then we'll open it up to questions.
So why comics are important in the creative writing classroom? I'm just going to reiterate briefly that I think my students have to write a reflection at the end of the semester about what they learned through the course, even if they don't plan to go on and do these things. And 201, they almost always talk about pacing and the importance of pacing, because when you teach comics, you have to teach that, each panel is a single moment, or ways to get around that if that's what you're going to do. But it makes them really slow down and look at each particular moment in a story, an essay, or a poem. And I think somebody said that one of their students said comics are like poetry. I feel that too, and I teach about that. With poets, we're all about concision, and because of the visual element of comics, you also have to be very concise with your words. And my students who are fiction writers and short story writers have to learn about dialogue and conveying and communicating in a short amount of space possible. I also just want to say, I think teaching comics in a creative writing program is super important in terms of recruitment and preparing our students to go out into the world. The genres are disintegrating, and hybridity is and I'm all for this. I think it's fabulous. And if we can prepare our students in multiple ways to meet that trend, but also just to be more creative, to go beyond the page of text-based work. So that's, again, I was lucky I went into a program that already had the class existing. But if you're looking for ways to convince people in your department to do this, I think show them the numbers of your students, do a survey with your students, and ask how many of them read comics. How many of them would be interested in learning that you don't have to know how to draw to be a comic, that you can just write the script. And then there's a whole other thing I teach about the collaborative nature between the writer of the script and the artist. The Michael Bendis book is great for this. And we talk about negotiating and the fact that what you write in the script is not the final word, and the final product could be very, very different. So collaboration becomes another skill that I think is super important for creative writers to have.
I echo a lot of that. So I won't repeat, but I think, defamiliarization of craft concepts, like teaching dialogue in comics is a totally new way to think about dialogue, which students have heard about for 100 years. But there is something about that tightening and the restrictions on the physical page that I think just re-energize students about craft concepts. And then, I agree about interdisciplinary work. I have found that my students more and more want to be interdisciplinary, and they're seeking ways to do that. I mentioned in my handout a little bit, in our College of Arts and Letters, we offer individualized interdisciplinary majors, where students create their sort of own coursework out of 3 different departments across the university. And they're not limited in the College of Arts and Letters, but I currently advise 5 students in individualized majors, and the language they use is very interesting. It's often sequential art, which is, I'm sure, a buzzword everyone's heard, graphic narrative, rarely comics, rarely scripting. So it's mostly sequential art and graphic narrative. But my students are very excited. I often find my creative writing students, and almost all the writers I know, are interdisciplinary in some way. We write and we also do music, or we also do, theater, or we also do art. And I think it's a great way to acknowledge the fact that artists are inherently interdisciplinary. And I agree that it's sort of a false thing to sort of say, you're a poet and you will only take poetry, and that's all you will ever be. So I also say that I think comics are a great way to sort of like loosen up my students who are very rigid and like worried about that. And that I find that once my students take comics, they find themselves writing in more poetic forms. They open up to borrowed forms more in their own traditional prose. So it's a great way to sort of shake them up, make them feel like, things are accessible. They might have comics are a gateway to video essays and multimedia. Mm-hmm. So this is all very energizing and exciting. And I agree that I think that if you just let administration know that your students are excited about this, they probably know that anyway. And they're just looking for you to just take the reins on that. That's why I think comics are so important. I started drawing again once I started teaching the interdisciplinary comics course, because I felt like I had to walk the talk. And now it's a big part of my writing. It's opened up a 3rd genre that I write in and publish in, and I've absolutely loved it. It's very therapeutic. It's relaxing. So I think just even as teachers, it can open us up to new things as well.
I don't think I have more to add, but I'm really curious about because what I see in my students a lot is just this playfulness and delight. And I wonder if there's, if I could just segue a little bit into the idea of sharing things that we do in our classes. I'm wondering if you two have favorite activities that you do or assignments that you do that really allow students to come into making comics.
Okay. It's so hard to pick a favorite. I think one of my favorites is graphic translation. I find that very energizing and exciting. The Paris Review has a really great series of graphic translations of Lydia Davis flash fiction. And they're great because some of them are very very literal translations, and others are much more personal, and it opens up a really exciting thing for writers, and it sort of takes the pressure off because the content's already there. I typically have them choose a poem of their choice, or I give them several more Lydia Davis stories because Lydia Davis is amazing. So I give them a few more that they can choose, and then they have a lot of fun translating. I pair that with teaching City of Glass, which is a Paul Auster novella from the New York trilogy that was translated beautifully by David Mazzucchelli and Paul Karasik. So that is a very exciting part of the semester for me, and I think students appreciate just kind of being free to translate, and it sort of takes the pressure off producing the text themselves.
One of my favorites is, they're kind of tied together. They're reverse engineering exercises. And the first is to reverse engineer a script. And so if we've all read volume 1 of Monstrous, then each student picks a page, and they have to go home and they have to write a script for that page with no thumbnails. When they come back in the next day, they have to give that page to someone else who has to draw the thumbnails. And that they learn a lot in that exercise about what they're communicating in the script to the artist versus what they're not. And then tied with that is reverse engineering dialogue. I don't know if you all know, but Margaret Atwood has entered the realm of comics with Angel Catbird. Yay, it's one of my favorite books. And so I take a 2-page spread of that and I color copy it, print it off in color, white out the dialogue, scan it into a PDF, put it up on the board, and they have to provide dialogue without knowing any. I guarantee you they don't know anything about the story, right? And oh, wait, had you read it before class?
No, but we didn't do that in my class.
Oh, okay. He was giving me the look, like, you're lying. Yeah, you can do it now. Anyway, and so then we have a lot of fun going around the room, people providing dialogue, and the students learn very, very quickly when they have written 60 words of dialogue for a bubble that's this big, you know, and they learn very quickly about that. So, and then they go read the book, and it's hilarious.
It is really hard to pick a favorite. I already mentioned some of the things they do. I think that I would say that diary comics are my favorite assignment because they always produce even more growth and development in students than I never thought they would be such a huge thing. And I think it's partly for many students who don't have an established daily practice of creativity, it's just really eye-opening for them in a lot of ways. But it also, you can see people's drawing style change over the matter of 5 to 7 weeks. A really fun exercise that anybody can do at any time is timed drawings. You can pick anything. You can do it with self-portraits, which is fun, but you could also just do like a car or a house or a castle or anything that people kind of have an idea of what it looks like, but maybe not really. And you start out by having 2 to 3 minutes to draw it. Then you do the same drawing over again in a minute, then 30 seconds, then 15 seconds. And it's a really wonderful, it forces the people who are super rigid to draw in a looser way. And once students have the 5 or 6 drawings spread out in front of them at the end, they can see that the one that they had the least time to do is often the most expressive and the most wonderful. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, if you're at an institution that isn't going right now, you don't have a class set up for comics, you can start bringing exercises into your fiction classes, your poetry classes. I want to give a shout out to the journal Ink Brick, which is a poetry comics journal, and they're online and have samples there. So in my forms of poetry class, we look at those, and my students actually have to produce a sketch thumbnails to one of their poems that they would have it produced as. I don't teach the other genres, but I think it would be really easy to use a piece of flash fiction or flash creative nonfiction and have them do thumbnails to it, and even maybe collaborate with an art friend to do the art if they're not artistic. And then, you can build up your own repertoire that way.
So I think we will open it up to questions from the audience. And maybe I'll just repeat the questions into the microphone to make sure that they're heard.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. This was absolutely wonderful. I very much relate to the backgrounds you all have entering into comics as teachers, because I don't think anyone starts out that way. They sort of find themselves there. I teach a couple courses that are similar to the ones described, and I'm currently writing a textbook, a creative writing textbook for comics for Bloomsbury. So actually I have a very specific question to the three of you. I'm familiar with all the texts that you have on your handouts. They're all quite wonderful. I'm curious, is there anything that you find is missing from those textbooks? Is there something that you wish was out there that isn't? Like either a section or a book overall approaches, things that you wish you had in a textbook.
So the question is, are there things missing from comics textbooks that we wish we had?
I can answer that. Yes. Yes, and I mean, it's like someday I would like to do that too. I would really love like an anthology of standalone comics, because a lot of the anthologies are excerpts, and it's very difficult. And so, yeah, I would love an anthology or a craft book that includes a nice short standalone piece that accompanies a craft element. I would really appreciate that, because I have created my own sort of list, and I included some of those on there. Standalone short essays, teachable short stories, graphic essays. The graphic short story prize that the Observer, which is a London literary magazine, runs the graphic short story prize every year. They beautifully post a lot of those. They're all 4-page comics. It's a wonderful resource, but I can't really print that off, all the time. So that's something I find that's missing.
Not being a huge connoisseur of the craft books, the only thing I would request in putting it together is to also consider diversity issues, which I'm sure you already know about. But other questions?
You just said you wanted to see anthologies. Have you guys looked into any self-published Kickstarter anthologies that exist out there and talking to your classes?
Yes.
I find that there's a lot of standalone stories in that with a common theme. There's a lot of creators of color that are Kickstarting their own work.
Yes, yeah.
So, sorry, I'll just repeat the question.
Oh, sorry.
We taught anthologies that are like more independent, often like self-published or on Kickstarter. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, my partner Cole Klosser he actually is starting a zine from our student work to sort of join that crowd that we're kickstarting as well. Because I agree, like that's sort of the place to go, and that's exciting too for students to see other people self-publishing that are just getting started, which is very like scary for people in academia sometimes to look at something that's self-published versus like through a big 5 publisher or like an academic publisher. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I often I have in the past assigned Best American Comics because it's been published annually since 2006, and it's gotten more and more diverse as the years have gone on in terms of having women and people of color in it. But it's a gigantic book as well, and so it's hard for students to carry around. I recommend a lot of webcomics to students, and there's different anthologies out there that are specifically queer or specifically creators of color. One anthology that I've been using recently is called Drawing the Line, which is an anthology of comics by women in India who are writing about sexual assault. So it's really intense material, and there's some amazing craft in there as well that students can study and apply to their own work.
I'm curious in any of your institutions if there's any connection between what you do in teaching comics as literature, or comics theory, or comics criticism. Who opened up the door for who, or how much overlap is there in your students?
Are there connections between our kind of teaching how to make comics and comics theory classes? Not in our school at this point.
We've started. One of my graduate students 2 years ago did her thesis as a long comic script, and so her critical introduction to that thesis, which our college requires, was a scholarly work utilizing the theory of Hilary Shute, who's a comic scholar that I really love. She writes Graphic Women, Disaster Drawn is another great one. So yes, and then I'm trying to sneak that in. I luckily get to... that's the beauty of teaching at the university. You get to kind of teach whatever I want. So I have included comics in my graduate narrative theory seminar, where we look at Art Spiegelman's essays on craft, Will Eisner, Hilary Shute again, who's great, and then some standalone scholarly work on the particular comics that we're reading. Just in comic journals like Narrative is a great one that publishes a lot of scholarly work on comics.
Being separate from the English department, there isn't a lot of crossover at UCA for us, and I do not believe they offer a course in it right now. So,
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
My name is Ethan. I'm a junior at University of Maryland, and that's a largely STEM school. So I was wondering, I've looked into taking a graphic comics course. They don't offer any. There's no clubs or anything for that kind of program. So I guess my question is, as a student, how might I go about commissioning or trying to get a course into the program for comic writing in the humanities, through the arts and humanities program? How would I approach a professor and convince them how you guys?
As a student, how do I approach a professor and convince them to teach a comics class? I don't know. You form a gang. You get a bunch of other students who are also really into it and approach look up and research your profs at your school. Don't mean to explain to you. But you know, like do some investigation about what profs might already be interested or likely to, like, who look kind of sketchy and might like kind of go that way, or people who are already doing similar things, right? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, if you have a good relationship with one of these professors, ask to do a directed study if you have that, and perhaps you can start the fire that may come in. And the other thing is, if you can get a gang together, that's what will convince. The administration is going to be all about the numbers. They need to be able to make the money to make the class make. So.
And I think it's also really worth looking at the different areas of comics that are really exploding right now. There are a lot of comics that are about science. I have a lot of students who are science students or math students or engineering students who are really interested in doing comics about what they're studying. There's a whole area called graphic medicine, which is comics about medical issues. So I'm happy to talk more about that with you. But there's all these areas of comics that are very relevant. To what you're studying. Should we take one more question and then?
I think it's 11:45.
No? Okay. So we're out of time, but we are all here and happy to talk as we get our stuff together.
All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for us here at the Southern Fried Geekery podcast for this episode. We'll be back together again for the regular format and all the good shenanigans that you know and love here. I hope you guys enjoyed this showing of panels from the AWP in Portland convention. It was a great time. I'm really tired. I'm sick of airports. I'm sick of planes. I'm ready to get home to my dogs and my husband and my Craig, my Jerry, and my Sean. Pick up some of the books that they were talking about in the different panels. Again, Craig Thompson's Blankets and Habibi, Rena Ayuyang's Blame This on the Boogie, James Stern's Market Day or the Golem's Mighty Swing, Peter Baggs' Hate, and his weird magazine stuff, which you can find collected. It's amazing. But also check out some of the craft texts that they talked about, like Understanding Comics and Making Comics from Scott McCloud, Words for Pictures by Brian Bendis. I mean, it's Bendis. And I have not personally read it, but I'm going to see if I can't find Ivan Brunetti's Cartooning Practices and Philosophy, because it sounds like a great bit of text. So we will see you again next time. Remember that you can come find us on our Facebook page. We're the Southern Fried Geekery Podcast on Facebook. We're at SFG Podcast on both Instagram and Twitter. We also have our email address, which you can check us out and send us any questions, comments, or concerns, southernfriedgeekery@gmail.com. If nothing else, guys, go forward, love some comics.